Thank you, Paula. Thank you, delegates. Good morning. The brief that I was given today is to briefly introduce the economic context in order that the other speakers can develop particular themes within this outline. So bearing in mind that we have a budget next week, I would like to take this opportunity to discuss a word that we will hear repeated consistently by George Osborne, and the word is the deficit. Attached to this word, we will also hear the phrase that it is absolutely necessary to eliminate the deficit. What I hope to convince you is that this policy is one of many choices that could be made. There is absolutely no necessity that we need to eliminate the deficit. But I will also argue that in selecting elimination of the deficit as his chosen strategy, what Osborne does not tell us is his secondary objective, and that is to minimise the public sector, to cut the public sector. Indeed, George Osborne uses, in inverted commas, the need to eliminate the deficit as his reason for cutting the public sector. I'll conclude my comments by raising three policy questions of what might be called an alternative economic strategy. You can use these policy questions as a basis for subsequent discussion. So there are 3 points I'd like to make about the deficit and the need to eliminate it. All of these points run counter to basic economic theory. And indeed, if George Osborne presented an essay to me with the content of his budget, you can guarantee he would get less than 40%. Just rest assured. His argument to start then is we need to balance the books. We need to reduce the deficit. So he defines a good economic policy entirely in terms of government spending and government income. This is not simply correct. It is wrong. A good economic policy has many other different elements to it. And I will just illustrate 2. The first of which concerns our trading position. Osborne will make no reference next week to the rising trade deficit. That is, what we are doing is we are importing goods into the country at a far faster rate than we are making goods and exporting them. And of course, if we continue like this, what it means is any economic growth in the country will be born of your debt on your credit cards. As you go out and buy Samsung tellies and Bosch washing machines. And the point I make here is, if you have economic growth born of consumer credit, eventually you crash. It is not a basis for economic growth. So that is one thing that Osborne will not talk about and will take no action on. And it will be there, and it will fester throughout this term of office. A second point, which makes a very similar argument, is if you wish to have a balanced economic policy, you must have short-term, medium-term, and long-term elements. All of these elements must be integrated into the policy. But what we have is a short-term policy. It is a policy where, for example, we sell off our assets, so we have short-term cash. We've sold the Green Investment Bank, we've sold Eurostar, that's good news. We have money coming into the exchequer, but of course, in the long term, where does that money go? And the answer is we never see it again. And in the case of the Green Investment Bank and Eurostar, these assets were bought by foreign investors. So any subsequent interest payments or dividend payments are nothing to do with the UK. Nothing to do with the UK at all. They are to do with the countries where these overseas investors came from. In other words, we've made a short-term gain, but we have no long-term policy attached to that short-term gain. A second area which would contribute to Osborne's 40% mark. He argues that there are no choices with regard to the balance between expenditure and revenue. So, he says, given we have a deficit, we must make cuts to address this deficit, to eliminate this deficit. And the plan as it currently stands says by the financial year 2019-2020, if we exclude spending on health, public expenditure will fall as a proportion of GDP to the level it was in 1948. Now, I wasn't born in 1948, but history tells me it wasn't a good year. It was not a good year. So that's the direction of travel. But he goes on, because he says, not only have we to reduce the deficit and to do so quickly, but the way he sees we should reduce the deficit is 90% savings, 90% cuts, and 10% rise in taxation. This is clearly an ideological choice. Even if you were committed to cutting the deficit in the short term, you could do so by raising taxes to account for 90% of the reduction and 10% by cuts, and any proportions between. The choice is yours. It is not something that is fixed. Even better, of course, you could embark on a policy based on economic growth. So therefore, income from taxation would increase as people earned more and worked more. So my point is the choice that the Tories make is ideological. And my third key criticism is that the security of the nation, of you and I, is defined in terms of government bookkeeping. He argues, when the deficit is eliminated, we will all be happy boys and girls. There's a word that comes to mind, it begins with B, ends with T, and has 8 letters. That's how considered that economic policy is. And let me just illustrate that absolutely simply. The time we were most insecure in recent years was in 2007 to 2009. In that time, there was a banking crisis. And for those with deposits, we were all worried, where's our money? Is it safe? Right? Incidentally, a Labour Party got us out of that crisis. But my point is, this was nothing to do with the state of public expenditure. It was all to do with banks lending vast amounts of money to people who, frankly, whose credit rating they did not adequately check. It was nothing to do with balancing the books. In other words, the banking crisis was a failure of regulation and, to a degree, a failure of management. Managers in the banks did not know what those they were managing were doing, is the bottom line, and that is inadequate management by any reference. So my point is threefold. Firstly, balancing the books is not necessarily the way forward. To do it in the short term is economic madness, and to do it in the way that George Osborne will propose in the budget is ideological, not economically sound. So let me now raise 3 questions for subsequent discussion. And I should say, Osborne isn't going to mention any of these either in his contribution next week. The first question I ask you is, integral to any notion of economic renewal must be more investment in infrastructure. So the policy question is, can such investment take place without increases in taxation? Yes, no. If no, how do you persuade the public to increase taxation? If yes, how can it be achieved without increasing taxation? A second question I would ask you concerns economic inequality. There is a huge array of economic evidence that suggests when financial inequality reaches particular levels, then there is an adverse effect on economic growth. To put it another way, when economies become very unequal, economic growth tails off and slows down. Okay? Let me just illustrate where we are. If you take the FTSE 100 chief executive officers, so these are the guys who run FTSE 100 companies, and you compare their earnings with that of the average UK worker. In 1980, the chief executive officer of the FTSE 100 companies earned £18, whereas the average UK worker earned 1. A ratio of 18 to 1. By 1998, that ratio had risen to 57 to 1. Bear in mind, Labour was in power for some of that period. In 2012, the ratio is 162 to 1. That is a level of inequality matched only in Victorian UK. And remember, when that level was reached in around 1880, the Victorian economy fell away. That is what we are looking for. Would too. So my policy question is, how do you set about reversing this pattern of inequality? And finally, we've had years of governments, I should say of both persuasions, which have resulted in the UK becoming a low-wage and low-productivity economy. Instead of investing in machinery, what we do is we throw more workers at the task. And this view, I should say, is not just my own, but it is also shared by Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England, and he should know. Osborne and Cameron repeatedly make presentations arguing that France is an economic basket case. The French can't organise anything at all. An average French worker produces 130 items. His British counterpart produces 100 in the same time. And it's not because the French worker is working harder. It's because the French worker is working smarter. Research and development attached to his or her job. As a consequence, they can be much more productive. Of the G7 nations, we are 6th from 7. But again, next week, you won't hear George Osborne outlining how productivity can be improved. And if we don't improve productivity, then quite frankly, we're going nowhere fast. We're going downhill, perhaps, rather quicker than we would prefer. So my third question then is, how can we achieve a long-term shift towards a high productivity, high wage high investment economy. It's only in that, if we achieve that, will we be able to go forward. We cannot compete with China on wages alone. Can't be done. And for those that think we can, that is pie in the sky. Thank you very much.